Every time we get in the car with our kids, the kids ask us, where are we going? Anyone else's kids do that? And I want to get mad at them, but I used to ask my parents I used to ask them the same thing, where are we going? And my dad would respond in two ways. One, the moon, okay? We're going to the moon. Or two, crazy. We're going crazy. Okay? He was the king and is the king of corny dad jokes. So guess what I tell my kids when they ask me where are we going? So I'm the exact same thing, all right? Don't underestimate the power of parenting. It sticks with your kids. But the story that we're entering into this morning is the story of a journey. It's the story of the Hebrews' journey from Egypt to the Promised Land. And God has already revealed the destination and the promise to Moses. So I'm going to go ahead and give you the main point that we'll work through this morning. So in your notes, you can write down this if you're taking notes. Main point is this: God promises to fulfill redemption for his children. God promises to fulfill redemption for his children. Moses has heard the promise. Moses has heard of the destination, but the journey to get there is not one without issues. See, Moses in the back seat, he's struggling to understand where God is taking them. Where are we going? How long until we get there? God's promises to fulfill redemption for his children. But as we'll find out this morning, and what Moses realized in the journey, that it would not be as expected. So I'm going to be in Exodus 5, if you have a Bible. Exodus 5. We'll start in verse 1. If you have notes, all of that's on the back. Digital Bible, I'll read out of the ESV. Exodus 5, starting in verse 1. I'll pray as we start. God, let me give you a little setup here. The mission of redemption has been given. The mission has been accepted by Moses, but not without pushback. So his brother Aaron will be the mouthpiece of the mission. God was about to release the children, the Hebrews, out of captivity from Egypt. And so what we find at the end of chapter 4 and at the beginning of chapter 5, God sends Aaron out into the wilderness to meet his brother. And so they meet on the mountain of God and they embrace each other. And Moses updates his brother on everything that God has shared with him. God will release the captives. And at this news, Moses and Aaron, they gather together the elders of Israel. And the elders are told this news of redemption, and signs are performed in front of their face. And what we find at the end of chapter 4, verse 31, is that the people believed. The text says that when they heard the word that the Lord had visited the people of Israel, the Lord had seen their affliction in Egypt, they bowed their heads and they worshiped. It was happening. Everything that God had promised to Moses was becoming a reality. Everything that Moses had relayed to his brother was becoming true. Redemption had arrived. The people are overwhelmed with the news. They believe, they worship. Redemption revival has returned to the people of Israel. And like last week, that lasts about one verse. Because what we'll see in chapter 5, we see the redemption story isn't going to be as easy as the people assumed. It's not like God didn't warn them. God told Moses that Pharaoh wasn't going to let the people go without his mighty hand against them. But just because God tells you something doesn't mean you're actually listening. Moses wasn't paying attention. Or at the very least, he chose to ignore what God said. See, Moses and Aaron, they're about to experience a wake-up call in the mission. That God had promised to fulfill redemption for his children, but he didn't promise it was going to be easy. So chapter 5, it kicks off Moses and Aaron's first conversation with Pharaoh. And as you can guess, it didn't go as expected. So we'll start in verse 1 of chapter 5. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went and said to Pharaoh, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. But Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let the people of Israel go? I don't know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go. Then they said, the God of Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go a 3 days journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God, lest we fall upon us the pestilence or with sword. It feels like a weird introduction to this conversation. I don't know if there was some small talk going on before this happened, but Moses and Aaron, they get straight to business in the story. Thus says the Lord. Same introduction we saw last week. Yahweh, I am who I am. The Lord, the God of Israel, says, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. Now pause. Put yourselves in the shoes of Pharaoh. You're a god of your own Egyptian kingdom. People answer to you. People bow to you. You have Hebrew slaves out there building your empire. And now there's two representatives that come and say, their God makes commands? Their God owns my people? Their God says what's next? And so Pharaoh, he responds accordingly in verse 2, who's the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I don't know the Lord, and I'm certainly not going to let these people go. And I'm sure Moses and Aaron were aware this wasn't going to be simple, but not aware how quickly pushback would come. And so they have a quick rebuttal. The God of the Hebrews, in verse 3, the God of Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go out 3 days' journey to sacrifice to the Lord our God. Now, I don't know if that's a trick to Pharaoh, because obviously they weren't going to be gone for just 3 days. They're trying to get out of town for good. And if we don't do this, Pharaoh, the Lord might strike us with pestilence or disease, and the sword might be against us. Please, Pharaoh. Do you want all your slaves to die? Now, in fairness, that's a pretty strong argument from Moses and Aaron. At the very least, it would seem like something Pharaoh would consider, but that's not what happens. Look at verse 4. But the king of Egypt said to them, Moses and Aaron, why do you take the people away from their work? Get back to your burdens. And Pharaoh said, behold, the people of the land are now many, and you make them rest from their burdens. Moses and Aaron, why do you take the people from their work? It's possible that the word has spread around town. Okay, so the Lord has visited his people. The people are talking rather than working. And Pharaoh says, and I paraphrase, the Hebrew people are growing in numbers, and y'all are making them rest from their burdens. Fear, worry, doubt. It's washing over Pharaoh. It's the same fear that's washed over many kings of Egypt. And the Hebrew slaves are growing in number. Large and angry numbers mean a danger to power. So what does he do? How do you keep an oppressed people quiet when hope begins to rise and revolt begins to bubble up inside? The answer is deeper oppression. So if they hurt now, you're going to make them hurt more. And we've seen this time and time again in history. Oppressed people stay oppressed by adding more to their burdens. It's evil. It's dark. It's the plan of Pharaoh. So look at verse 6. The same day, Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters of the people and their foremen, you shall no longer give the people straw to make bricks as in the past. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. But the number of bricks that they made in the past you shall impose on them. You shall by no means reduce it, for they are idle. Therefore they cry, let us go and offer sacrifice to our God. Let heavier work be laid on the men, that they may labor at it and pay no regard to lying words. Here's the game plan that he delivers to the taskmasters and the foremen of the work. Don't supply them any more straw. Make them search for the straw themselves, but keep that brick quota the same. A few years ago, we went on a mission trip to Zambrano, Honduras. And in Zambrano, there was a school that had a dirt floor in one of the classrooms. Okay, so they were having class in this dirt floor room. And so our team came in and we helped lay a concrete floor for the classroom. I don't know how to do any of this stuff, but I can listen to instructions. Okay, so once we got everything leveled out, we started cutting rebar, putting it all out, and then wiring it together. And that rebar, it helps strengthen the floor and keeps it from cracking and splitting. In Egypt, straw was the rebar for bricks. So the Hebrews, they did not have access to making bricks over a fire, so they put bricks together with clay and straw and then just let them harden out in the sun. So straw was not an optional ingredient in the process. It was necessary for the work to be accomplished, and now they're told that they need to go and find it for themselves. Pharaoh, he informs the taskmasters and the foremen of the news, and he ends with, "And pay no regard to their lying words." The Lord didn't visit his people. Don't listen to those lies. So the word, it moves from Pharaoh to the taskmasters, to the foremen, and now to the people of God. Look at verse 10. So the taskmasters and the foremen of the people went out and said to the people, "Thus says Pharaoh, I will not give you straw. Go and get your straw yourselves wherever you find it, but your work will not be reduced in the least." So the people, they're scattered throughout all the land of Egypt to gather stubble for the straw. The taskmasters were urged and saying, "Complete your work, your daily task each day, as there was straw." And the foremen of the people of Israel, whom Pharaoh's taskmaster had set over them, were beaten and were asked, "Why have you not done all your task of making bricks today and yesterday as in the past?" Then the foremen of the people of Israel came and cried to Pharaoh, "Why do you treat your servants like this? No straw is given to your servants, yet they say to us, 'Make bricks,' and behold, your servants are beaten, but the fault is in your own people." As expected, this plan is not working out well. It's keeping the Israelites quiet, but it's also getting them beat. So we see the foreman of the projects being beaten in verse 14. "Why have you not done all your task of making bricks today and yesterday as in the past?" Now, I don't know about you, but I've certainly worked jobs where the boss will ask me a dumb question that he already knows the answer to. Seriously, why do you think we're struggling to make all these bricks? We spend half our time just looking for the straw. So the foremen have had enough of the work environment. Apparently there's no HR department, so they go just straight to Pharaoh with a grievance. "Why do you treat your servants like this? You don't give us the straw, but you scream, 'Make bricks.' And your servants are beaten, but the fault is in your people." And then Pharaoh responds in verse 17. "But he said, 'You're idle. You are idle. That is why you say, 'Let us go and sacrifice to the Lord.' Go now and work. No straw will be given to you, but you must still deliver the same number of bricks." And the foremen of the people of Israel saw that they were in trouble when they said, "You shall by no means reduce the number of bricks, your daily task each day." And they met Moses and Aaron, who were waiting for them as they came out from Pharaoh, and they said to them, "The Lord look on you and judge, because you have made us stink in the eyes or in the sight of Pharaoh, and his servants have put a sword in their hand to kill us." The foremen, they realize that things have turned from bad to ugly and now deadly. Pharaoh is convinced that the people are idle. They're idle with all this wilderness talk. And since the people are so busy talking about God, then let's make them more busy by building bricks without straw. And the foremen become worried, because the Pharaoh has given them an impossible task. An impossible task that will surely end with beatings and possible death. And so it's time to deal with the root of the issue. Things were bad, but they weren't deadly until Moses and Aaron arrived on the scene. So they find these two brothers and they give a rebuke. The Lord, look on you and judge. You have made a stink in the eyes of Pharaoh and his minions. You have put the sword in their hands to kill us. Have you ever thought you were doing the right thing and it kind of blew up in your face? Have you ever tried to help someone and it just made more of a mess of the problem than when you started? This is not the redemption story we started a few weeks ago. This is supposed to be a story of hope. This is supposed to be a story of Yahweh, the great I Am, releasing his children from slavery. This is a redemption story. But the first proclamation of redemption in Egypt has only made things worse. So you can see why Moses responds in the next few verses. Look at verse 22. Then Moses turned to the Lord and said, O Lord, why have you done evil to this people? Why did you ever send me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to his people, and you have not delivered your people at all. Two questions from Moses and two statements. Why have you done evil to this people? God, why did you ever even send me? Since I've been here, Pharaoh has done evil to this people, and you have not delivered your people at all. This isn't the redemption story that Moses had in mind. Sure, he had heard God would fulfill his plan of redemption for his people, but this didn't feel right. He was already hesitant to go, and now his doubt was proving true. Where was God's promise of redemption? Maybe you've asked yourself that question. If God is the God of salvation, if God is the God of releasing the captives free, why doesn't it always feel that way? What's taking so long? Why is my life so full of struggle? Why isn't this working out like I thought it would? We know that God promises to fulfill redemption for his children, but I want to give us 4 things that God does not promise. In your notes, we'll quickly go through them. 4 things that God does not promise us while we follow him in obedience. 4 things that God never promised to Moses, and we see unfold in his life. So if you're a believer in Jesus Christ this morning, here are 4 things that God does not promise you. First one is this. God doesn't promise support from others will last. This is going to be a bummer message, just to let you know, okay? There's no way around it. God doesn't promise support from others will last. At the end of chapter 4, Moses and Aaron go marching back into town with news that ignites the people. The leaders and the people of Israel believe and they bow their heads in worship. This will be a relief moment for Moses and Aaron. They're not alone in the mission of redemption. The elders of Israel stand with them. The people of Israel are seeing hope pour over the land. But as we have read this morning, this word doesn't last long. It took one pushback for the people to bail on God's plan. It took one crisis moment for the people to question Moses and Aaron's news. See, God doesn't promise support from others will last, meaning God doesn't promise that people won't let you down as you pursue Christ. I can think of countless men in ministry that have blown up their lives and no longer following Jesus, or at the very worst, they're faking it. I can think of countless men and women that I grew up with. They were passionate about Jesus Christ in youth group, but now no longer following Jesus. And I might be so bold to even say that everyone in this room right now may not be following Jesus 10 years from now. God doesn't promise that support from others will last. The disciples followed Jesus until he was arrested. The first huge crisis moment in their life, and they all bail on him. They scatter away from the garden. In the Apostle Paul's second letter to Timothy, we find that he wasn't immune to this sort of affliction either. He says, "Do your best to come to me, for Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and has gone to Thessalonica." That's 2 Timothy 4, 9 through 10. Even the Apostle Paul experienced the heartbreak of others letting him down. Demas deserted Paul because he loved the world more than he loved Jesus. It's a tragedy we see over and over again. God doesn't promise that support from others will last. Some people will love all of the comforts and all of the pleasures and all of the trinkets of this world more than they love Jesus. So what will you do if you're the last man or woman standing? And that is so hard for us to relate to in the Bible Belt. We live in such a Christian-saturated culture that we can't even fathom being the only one that's faithful to God. So the goal is not to not trust people, like we're just going to walk around waiting for people to let us down. The goal is that as we trust people, we trust Christ greater. Jesus will not let you down. Jesus won't let his support for you fade. Jesus won't desert you in this life. God will never stop supporting you. He doesn't promise that support from others will last, but his support is eternal. Secondly, God doesn't promise that you'll be understood. God doesn't promise that you will be understood. In Moses and Aaron's first conversation with Pharaoh, Pharaoh shoots back, "Who's the Lord that I should obey his voice? I don't know the Lord." And later we heard Pharaoh warn the taskmasters and the foremen not to believe the lying words about the Lord God. As believers in Jesus Christ, we should not be shocked when we are a misunderstood people. It's as if we get freaked out or surprised that people look at us funny when we say we believe that there's this Jewish carpenter from 2,000 years ago who was actually God, and then he died, and then he came back to life. Christians are a misunderstood people because there are other people who do not know the Lord. They don't know the Lord, and they certainly aren't going to listen to his voice. This is 1 Corinthians 1, 18 through 20. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it's the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? As a follower of Jesus Christ, God does not promise that you will be understood. In fact, your message and your life will be viewed as foolish or a lie or a great myth. If there's any practical application here, don't expect your friend or your family members to obey the Lord when they don't even know the Lord. You're expecting the cart before the horse. Pharaoh didn't care about the obedience because he didn't know Yahweh. Don't expect your loved one to start obeying the Lord in righteousness when they don't even have a relationship with Jesus. That's not even logical. The hope of Christ is foolish to those that don't know the Lord. Don't be surprised or angry or full of rage when people don't understand you. It's been happening since the beginning. God doesn't promise that you will be understood. Thirdly, God doesn't promise that things won't get worse. God doesn't promise that things won't get worse. we wrongly assume that Christianity is like a peaceful train ride through the countryside. And it's just full of beautiful views and delicious food and comfortable conversations. We're just going to travel along in this peaceful train until we reach our final destination, and then we'll get off, and then we'll enjoy heaven for eternity. But Christianity is not a peaceful train ride through the countryside. Christianity is a roller coaster of ups and downs and detours and drops and thrills and dangers and wins and losses. It's anything but a gradual climb of comfort. And as we see in Exodus 5 and riddled throughout the Bible, is that life can get worse. God doesn't promise his children an easy life. God doesn't promise that your situation won't even get worse than it is right now, at least not on this side of eternity. 2 Corinthians 11 will be on the screen. Are they servants of Christ? I'm out of my mind talking like this. I am more. I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers and dangers from bandits and dangers from my fellow Jews and danger from Gentiles and danger in the city and danger in the country and danger at sea and danger from false believers. I have labored and I've toiled and I have gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and I have gone without food. I've been cold and I've been naked. I'll never forget what I heard on a mission trip to Logan, West Virginia a few summers ago with students. Someone said that the call of Christ is not to pick up your couch and follow him. The call of Christ is to pick up your cross and follow him. Moses and Aaron and the Israelites learned the hard way that the road to redemption is paved with much suffering. That we are called to pick up our cross and follow Christ. We are not promised it will be easy. It's not easy to follow Christ when someone you love is sick. It's not easy to follow Christ when your job doesn't pay enough. It's not easy to follow Christ when you're dealing with addiction in your family. It's not easy to follow Christ when your friends don't seem that serious about their faith. God doesn't promise that things won't get worse this side of eternity. In fact, he promised things will get worse. 2 Timothy 3. But understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty. For people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud and arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than the lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness, but denying its power. Avoid such people. For among them are those who creep into the households and capture weak women, burdened with sins, and led astray by various passions, always learning and never being able to arrive at the knowledge of truth. God doesn't promise that things won't get worse. We are not called to comfort, but to bear our cross, surrounded by people that don't know or obey the Lord. And lastly, this. God doesn't promise clarity in the middle. God doesn't promise clarity in the middle. We find a very real moment for Moses at the end of chapter 5. Things are not the way they're supposed to be. We find Moses questioning God. It won't be the last time it happens. Why'd you let evil happen to your people? Why'd you ever send me? And I feel the honesty and transparency and frustration of Moses. I feel that honesty and transparency and frustration in my own life. You're trying to do the right thing. You're trying to be obedient to God, and life is just not shaking out the way that you thought it would. We are living in the middle, and we're not promised clarity in the middle of God's plan. I know bad things happen because sin has wrecked everything, but I don't know why it has to happen to children who get cancer. I don't know why people have to spend their life loving other people and then they still get sick. I don't know why people that live with integrity and they work hard and they still lose their jobs. I don't know why. There is lack of clarity in the middle. Moses didn't know how God was going to use this mess for his redemption plan, but he was. And I don't know how God is working in your mess right now for a greater redemption story, but he is. On January 8th, 1956, it's a 28-year-old American missionary named Jim Elliot was martyred, and along with 4 missionary partners and their friends as they ministered to a remote tribe in Ecuador. Survived by his wife, Elizabeth, and their 10-month-old daughter. This is a piece from Elizabeth's book. It's called Suffering is Never for Nothing, and I'll finish with this. When I stood by my shortwave radio in the jungle of Ecuador in 1956 and I heard that my husband, Jim Elliot, was missing, God brought to my mind the words of the prophet Isaiah. When thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee. You can imagine that my response was not terribly spiritual. I was saying, but Lord, you're with me all the time. But I want is Jim. I want my husband. We have been married 27 months after waiting 5.5 years. 5 days later, I knew that Jim was dead. And God's presence with me was not Jim's presence. That was a terrible fact. God's presence didn't change the terrible fact that I was a widow, and I expected to be a widow until I died because I thought it was a miracle that I got married in the first place. I couldn't imagine that I'll ever get married a second time, let alone a third, and God's presence didn't change the fact that my widowhood, Jim's absence, trust me, forced me, hurried me to God, my hope and my only refuge. And I learned in that experience who God is in a way that I could never have known otherwise. And so I can say to you that suffering is an irreplaceable medium through which I learned an indispensable truth. God is God. Well, I still want to go back and say, but Lord, what about the little child with spinal bifida? What about those babies who were born terribly handicapped with terrible suffering because their mothers were on cocaine or heroin or alcohol? And I can't answer your questions or even my own except in the words of Scripture. These words from the Apostle Paul, who knew the power of the cross of Jesus, and this is what he wrote. For I reckon that suffering of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which we shall be revealed in us, for the earnest expectation for the creature waited for the manifestation of the sons of God. The creation was made the victim of frustration. All those animals, all those babies who have no guilt whatsoever, not by its own choice, but because of him who made it so, yet there's always hope. This is the part that brings me immeasurable comfort. The universe itself is to be freed from the shackles of mortality and upon the liberty and splendor of the children of God. Where does the idea of a loving God come from? It's not a deduction. It's not a man so desperately wanting a God that he manufactures him in his mind. It's he who was the Word before the foundation of the world, suffering as a lamb. She ends with this. And he has a lot up his sleeve that you and I haven't the slightest idea about now. He's told us enough so we can know that suffering is never enough, never for nothing. We are not promised support from others will last. We're not promised we'll be understood. We're not promised things won't get worse. We're not promised clarity in the middle. But what we can be sure of is that our suffering is never for nothing. that God has promised to fulfill redemption for his children. It's what he reminds Moses at the beginning of chapter 6. It's what he reminds us today, that there is an eternal hope of glory promised to the children of God. So as we close, here's a simple prayer for believers today. God, keep our minds on the hope you promise. God, keep our minds on the hope that you promise. Your suffering is never for nothing. Let's pray.